Hello everyone, this is the Think and Read podcast. I am Tom Vieira. In this episode, we explore the life of Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher who famously said, "What do I know?" Montaigne lived during a very tumultuous time in Europe. It was the time of the Protestant Reformation and also of the Copernican Revolution. He sought to find peace and answers to a lot of the questions he had, so he returned home and wrote his famous essays there. In fact, he's the inventor of the modern essay. And he was a critic, and he was a skeptic. He had different ideas about a lot of the things that there were common beliefs regarding, like witches and cannibals. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to find more episodes from the Think and Read podcast, please go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much. About 15 years ago, my wife and I did something crazy. We decided to leave our busy life in the city and to move out to the country where we would raise our kids. And we're still in the country. We live on a farm, and so we've never looked back. And maybe that's part of why I'm drawn somewhat to Michel de Montaigne's life and his story. I recall something of the urge to leave the busyness and to pursue a slower and quieter way of life. That's always going to be more complicated than you think it's going to be, and something of that also was true for Michel de Montaigne. He was 38 years old when he, in the peak of his life, in his career as a lawyer with political influence, he decided to withdraw from public life and return to his family home. It was a beautiful estate. He came from wealth, privilege. It was the property was made in the image of a Roman villa. His father, Pierre, actually fought in the French army and spent some time in Italy and returned wanting to bring something of the high Italian culture to his castle and his family. So Montaigne grew up speaking only Latin. In fact, his father hired a German tutor who didn't know a lick of French just to make sure that Montaigne was only speaking Latin. This is not totally a crazy thing. It was the language of the educated in Europe, and was still that way at the time. But still, his father was very serious about this, and so Montaigne grew up reading Virgil and Ovid and Horace and so on. When Montaigne returned to his family home in 1571, it was bittersweet. There was certainly a part of him that did want to leave the busy life behind and to pursue quietude and to pursue philosophy and gardening. He was wanting to create a self-portrait, as he called it, and that would be his essays. More on that in just a minute. He described this as, dedicating himself to the muses. But there was another part of his return, which was a little bit more bitter than sweet. He came home on the heels of the two greatest losses that he suffered in his life. The first one was the loss of his closest friend in 1563, so Montaigne was 30 at the time. His closest friend took ill and passed away very quickly, and it was a big, big blow for Montaigne. And then a few years later, in 1568, his father passed away, and this left Montaigne heir of the family estates. He kind of held on for a few more years in Bordeaux and Paris, but eventually returned home in 1571, and is really committed to living a different sort of life. There was one key event that may have been the catalyst, or perhaps the decisive event that brought him to come home, because it happened about a year before he finally made this move. So he was out on a horse ride with some other men when, out of nowhere, a rider slammed into the back of Montaigne, and somehow he couldn't stop in time. In any case, Montaigne relates that, everything went black, and when he finally came to. He was coughing up blood, and he was clawing at his chest for air. He thought he was dying, in fact. This experience stayed with him the rest of his life. But he says something really strange about what happened. He says that he recalls feeling no pain at all. He says, the fact is that I was not even there at all. Which is really interesting. It's connected to this idea, as we have seen from Montaigne, regarding death, that death is for him the gateway to peace. He would call it the sort of the beginning of a new kind of freedom, right? He wrote this about this experience that he had, that he said, death could have a friendly face. If you don't know how to die, don't worry. Death will tell you what to do on the spot, fully and adequately. She will do this job perfectly for you. Don't bother your head about it. Okay, I think it's worth pausing, because this seems like it's maybe in tension with what we talked about regarding Montaigne's view of death in the previous episode, because Montaigne did stress that we ought to think about death all the time, right? We ought to wait for it at every turn. We got to make death familiar, right? Remove its strangeness, those sorts of things. And now he's saying, don't bother your head about it. So what's going on here? And I think we can resolve the tension here this way. When he says, don't bother your head about it, I think the mistake we might make about putting our minds on death is trying to make sort of mental preparations or provisions for that dying moment. Sort of practicing. He does talk about practicing death or building your death, but he does not have in mind making mental preparations for how you will handle that moment when it comes. As he says here, nature will tell you what to do on the spot. He has this very interesting, like he thought he was going to die, and yet he was at peace with it. Almost, ready to enter in. He describes experiencing this as though he were looking on himself through the eyes of somebody else, as though he weren't even there at all. So all of this, whatever this really means for Montaigne, it at the very least means this: don't worry about your dying moment, what that's going to look like or what that's going to feel like. When it happens, nature, he says, makes you ready for it, for your entrance into this new kind of freedom. So what do we think about when we're practicing our death or thinking about death or waiting for death and making it familiar? What he's getting at, I think, is the mental discipline of remembering what death is. Death is the origin of another life. He says that the loss of life is not an evil. These are the sort of objectively true qualities, facts about death. He says at one point that in the essay that we focused on in the last episode, death does not concern you, dead or alive. Alive, because you are. Dead, because you are no more. It's interesting. He says death only exists when you're alive, because when you're dead, you're no more. So the idea or the reality or the fear or the presence of death isn't even really a thing, because you are now no thing. You've returned to that from whence you came. So, all right, well, leaving aside whatever philosophical questions we might have about that, I think that's what he is getting at with this idea of bringing your mind to death, reminding yourself of its true nature. And I think it's part of why he wanted to return home. He never forgot this near-death experience. It stayed with him. Whatever we want to say, again, about what happened there, in Montaigne's mind, the thought of death and what he experienced in that moment brought him to see that the most important question is how I to live my life. What do I want this to look like? So he came home. He wanted to pursue philosophy, and he wanted to spend time in his garden. Okay, so before we talk more about this pursuit of philosophy and how that was really a sort of more complicated picture, as I alluded to a little bit ago, because the demands of public life never really left him fully, and we'll come back to that. But let's back up in Montaigne's life a bit. He lived in a very, very complicated world, a quickly changing world. Montaigne was Roman Catholic, and he remained Roman Catholic his entire life. And so he would have seen the world, quite likely anyway, as a matter of both nature and of grace. It's kind of a typical, at least a sort of more Thomistic way to understand the world, that there's the realm of nature, that's the realm of philosophy and the realm of science and reason and argument and so on. And there's the realm of grace, which is the realm of the church. It's the realm of sacraments and scripture and revelation and theology and God. And here's the interesting thing. Both of those realms were undergoing major changes, lots of controversy there. Think about the realm of nature. It's the time of the Copernican Revolution, right? And it's the emergence of modern philosophy and science. Descartes was soon to come. Galileo was soon to come, right? It's no longer the case that the Earth is the focal point of all of God's creation. Earth is in motion, which is contrary to what we experience with our senses. I mean, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of change, a lot of dialogue there. And then in the realm of grace, the realm of the church, the realm of religion, we have the Protestant Reformation going on. New questions about God and our relationship with God by way of the church and a relationship to the scriptures and so on. Controversies were all over the place. This was Montaigne's world. This was the world of the late 16th century. And it was profoundly important for his life. It shaped how he thought about things. In fact, I think it has a lot to do with how he ends up doubling down on the church. We have to have the church, or tradition in the midst of all these uncertainties. Okay. So this is the world he's growing up in. I mentioned a bit ago that his father gave him a sort of Latin-only education, right? And he's sort of reading these great Latin authors and so on. But at the age of 6, roughly, his father, for some reason, sent him to school. And it was there that he lost some of his Latin fluency and was, kind of start learning Greek. And as a teenager, he would study some philosophy, apparently. But he was on his way to a career in law with some political involvement, like his father. And by the time Montaigne was 21, he becomes a lawyer, and he's in the Parliament, Bordeaux, and his father is mayor of Bordeaux. So I mean, he's involved, rubbing elbows, as it were, with other important people in this part of France. And yet at the same time, Montaigne is not just interested in law and practical matters of society. He's reading Plutarch, and he's reading Lucretius and Seneca, and he's kind of pursuing what we kind of think of as humanities, right? He's a Renaissance man. This was something that we encounter with Pascal as well. This was a very sort of important part of Europe at this time. It was an important ideal, the well-rounded person, and it's not a time of specialization, but of varied pursuits and interests, and it had everything to do with what it meant to be a fully developed human being, as it were. And I think this is really key for Montaigne. That he really never lost sight of his early love for the Latin greats, as it were, and the sort of major figures of Western thought, but a particular streak of Western thought that we'll talk about more as we go along. Okay, and so I mentioned as he comes into his 30s, the sort of the two major events, the loss of his close friend and the loss of his father. I want to mention one more as well. So his first daughter was born in 1570, which was the year before he returned home. We don't know a lot about his wife, but we do know that they shared 6 children together, but only one of them survived. So Montaigne certainly knew something about death and how quickly life can just flee us, right? How quickly we can go, and so he returns to his home and he sets to work on writing these essays. Okay, so there's something really interesting about these essays, that the way in which Montaigne thought of it, because he thought of his essays sort of like the way an artist thinks of a self-portrait, which was becoming something of a thing at the time. Artists would create these self-portraits and put them up in their studios. And Montaigne wanted to do that, but it wasn't a depiction of his physical appearance, but something of a picture of his soul, a picture of he called it the slant of his mind. And he actually found that to be more challenging than perhaps he originally thought. In the next episode, I do want to take up this topic of self-knowledge, because what Montaigne is doing here is really fascinating philosophically, and it's not entirely new. Of course, the Greeks gave some thought to the issue of what does it mean to know yourself. Know thyself is an old Greek adage, but for Montaigne, this has an element of, let's call it subjectivity to it, this idea of a self-portrait that I think is new and different and sort of anticipates a much more modern way of thinking about the whole question of self-knowledge. So again, I'll get to that in the next episode. For now, what I'd like to discuss the last 20 years, roughly, of Montaigne's life, from 1571, that's when he returns home, until the year of his death, 1592, about a few months shy of his 60th birthday. It's during this time that he would publish his essays. And there's 2 things in particular that I want to stress about this period. The first is that Montaigne wrote his essays, especially the first 2 books, which are the first 2 sort of collections of essays, out of what scholars have sometimes called his crisis of melancholy. He struggled with depression. Montaigne addresses this, actually. He says that the attempt to write these essays was in some way an attempt to deal with this depression, which is very interesting to me. He, of course, lost his closest friend and his father, as we have mentioned, the losses of his children, as we have mentioned. Those things were certainly significant. But it's also Montaigne, again, finding himself in this bewildering world. It's a Copernican world. It's the world of Martin Luther and Protestantism, and not just Roman Catholicism. One interesting note about this, in fact, in 1572, which is actually the first year that he started to write his essays, it's also the same year of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands of Huguenots, basically French Protestants, were just slaughtered at the command of Catherine de Medici. It's things like this that are going on. France ripped apart, particularly in his area in France and in southern France. There's civil wars, constant civil war. They actually lasted all the way until his death and beyond. So it's this dynamic and really unstable and, in fact, very turbulent world that he was trying to understand and wrestle with and make sense of. And there's something of the turbulence of the external world that may be connected in some way with the turbulence of his inner world. And secondly, Montaigne is not just working out his melancholy or depression. He is a very curious and atypical thinker. We can probably call it his method, Montaigne's method, which is in some sense anticipating Descartes' method, and that's intentional because what Montaigne does here is going to directly impact the way Descartes would go about his doubting until he arrives at the cogito. So the idea roughly is that Montaigne is a guy that's not really going to just take things on trust. He doesn't trust common beliefs, common ways of thinking or doing. He's not going to just simply find answers in books. He loved his books, but he also denied being a bookworm, as it were. He said at one point, I think he said that he would spend like an hour a day at the most in his books. And so, yeah, he loved his Lucretius and his Seneca and so on. But the important point here is he wanted to search things out for himself. He wasn't going to just trust what we might call the received tradition of knowledge. Being sort of a scholar on Aristotle or Plato or Aquinas, something like that's not really it for him. It's a great story that he tells in one of his essays about witches. So it's kind of a great example of this. That witches, well, there were women locked up who themselves said were witches, right? And you have this kind of cultural stigma with witches, and he wanted to see them for himself, and he got the chance to one time, and so he visited some 10 or 12 witches, he says, and he writes this. He says, by the end, in all honesty, I would have prescribed not hemlock for them, but hellebore, which apparently is how you medicinally treat insanity. And so you get his point, right? That they're not wicked, they're insane. And this is why he concludes, he goes on to say, it seemed to be more a matter of insane minds than of delinquents, right? So, that's a classic example of Montaigne arriving at his own atypical conclusion. He did the same thing with cannibals. There's nothing that, sort of troubled a cultivated European more than a cannibal, right? And cannibal, sort of roughly equivalent with, there is cannibalism, but it's barbarism, right? It's the idea of the barely human person out there. And he takes up this topic in an essay where he says they're a whole lot more like us than we think they are. We're a whole lot more like them than we think we are. So, and it's not that, we got to be careful here because, yes, this does sort of bring up the idea of, let's say, like the noble savage. Rousseau will, kind of other romantic thinkers later on will talk about, this idea of the noble savage and, maybe romanticize a little bit of the primitive individual. But that's not really what Montaigne's talking about. He's not saying that, they're really virtuous or noble or something. There is something really bestial or savage or uncouth or something about these people. But what he's trying to say is that Europeans are not much better. That's his point. And so the St. Bartholomew Day massacre is kind of an example of that. The constant civil wars, kind of an example of that. Just for example, the Fourth Civil War began in 1572, the same year the massacre, and it's the first year of him starting his essays. Skip forward a little bit to 1580. That's when the first edition of his essays comes out, and it's the Seventh Civil War by that point. Okay, you have this story of the invincible armada getting blown to bits. You've got the murder of Henri de Guise, and this is a troubled Europe. This is not a Europe full of virtue and civilization and culture in some kind of impeccable way. And it's very Montaigne. In other places, he says that not even, ancient glorious figures like Homer or Socrates are sort of, godlike. They're more men than they are anything else. He really sees this commonality among people and emphasize that in his essays, which I think is a very important and interesting aspect to his thought. Okay, let's go forward to the year 1580, because there's this interesting story that happens in that year. And again, it's when the first edition of his essays was published. And there's this interesting story where he traveled to Rome, and his books are impounded there. But he somehow was able to maintain good relations, and he was able to meet with this high-ranking member of the Roman Catholic Church who gave him some suggestions for some changes. He actually had the audience of the Pope at one point. So, that's a very interesting and typical example of Montaigne coming across as a guy that apparently was hard not to like. He was a very agreeable man, and it's probably why he continued to find himself back in public life. He would come back from Rome, and in fact, I believe, I may be mistaken about this, but I believe it was while he was away, he learned of his being elected mayor of Bordeaux, and he was reluctant, but he agreed to it, and then he would be reelected in 1583. So this is sort of the Montaigne that, yes, he left public life, wanted the solitude of his home, but could never quite fully leave it. And similar to his father in terms of his political position as well. In the final version of the essays, his third edition, this was in 1588, we get a new third book, and it's in that book that we get his most mature thinking, and we find some fascinating insights about what it was like to write these essays, to create this verbal or written self-portrait, as it were. And so we'll take that up in the next episode. Montaigne died in 1592. He took ill, requested a final mass that was said in his bedchamber, in his bedroom. He was 59 years old. His widow, along with one or two others, would publish the first posthumous edition of the essays, and they included the final sort of edits and changes that Montaigne wanted to make but could never finish. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the life of Michel de Montaigne. Our question is to think or not to think. Bye for now.